All right, as I mentioned earlier this evening, Kathleen Kelly, HAS has been working on her property since January of last year. First, we did a metal detecting survey. Then we were lucky to get a grant from the Summerlee Foundation to do some imaging out there and some LiDAR. And eventually that segued into what we're doing now, which is just good old-fashioned archaeology up at the top of the hill where her house and barn and all that are located. I'm not going to steal any of her thunder. I'll let her give you the story as she wants to hear it. But basically, as I mentioned earlier, the gentleman that used to live on the property, Samuel May Williams, was a very important character in Texas colonial history that I knew absolutely nothing about until we got involved in this project. And now I'm studying the man as much, well, not nearly as much as her. She'll have to tell you about all the artifacts and things that are stored down at the Rosenberg Library in Galveston also. So without further ado, Kathleen Dennis Kelly.
Thanks. Y'all are great. I really appreciate it. Let's see if my little thing's gonna work. Of course not. Okay, so. Okay, I need to figure out how to advance, and I may need her back since it doesn't look like my thing's working. Oh, there, okay. So, can you hear me now? I apologize. I'm just getting over a cold, so I've got my lozenges here if it gets really awful. But, you know, you always asked if you can put a title to something when you're going to give a talk. And after a bunch of thought, I thought, you know, it really is about the fact that not only was Samuel May Williams totally obscured from any narrative you read about Texas history, but the garden lots are as well. And in fact, Frank made the comment, you know, that I live outside of we call it San Philip. Indeed, I live on the inside in the city limits, right on the edge. And that's the whole point. No one, even when I've had my interactions with the local constabulary, they have a hard time believing that, you know, this is indeed still part of the city limits. So, so what I want to do, and I'm really struggling with this. Let's see. I'm a Mac user, so I apologize. I don't even know how I got. So where do I push to?
This is not working.
It doesn't appear to be. Let's see. It did work.
Okay, good.
Praise God. Yes. Okay. How about that? Is that better?
Yes,
Okay. So first of all, I always like to know where we're going and talk. So I have several goals that I want to achieve. Hopefully we'll have time to do that. You can still ask questions if you have any. But basically, Samuel May Williams has been given a terrible rap over time, and yet he did so much during the ramp up in the colony, the creation of the colony, and in fact, quite a bit after until his death in Galveston in 1857. And moreover, when people talk about San Felipe de Austin, all they think is those little bitty higgledy-piggledy lots in the center of town. And yet, by 1827, the entire intelligentsia of the colony moved with Austin. And we'll talk a little bit about why that was. Moreover, people have a tendency to say, yeah, they burned the town. Well, they didn't burn the whole town. They burned the town lots in advance of the Mexican army. So these are all little nuances that actually make an awful lot of difference. And the last thing I want to do is try really hard to talk about the intersection of historical research, of which I had done quite a lot about over the decade or so that I was out there, and historical archaeology, because I mean, the two go so beautifully together, and yet many times people don't understand that intersection. So I want to try to use Williams as a way of understanding sort of how he lived through some of the artifacts. But first, what I want to do is talk about the colony so we're all kind of on the same page. I was just talking with Emma earlier about, why was it in the first place that these people decided to up stakes and move to a different country? Because they knew it was ruled by entirely different laws. The language was Spanish. They would have to pledge allegiance to the Catholic faith, all of which were not things that most people were willing to do. But they also understood that there was absolutely no way that they could amass the amount of land that they needed if they stayed in the U.S. So they were willing to go because of the allure of the land. And the other thing, obviously their goals were to become successful farmers and ranchers, but the sort of underbelly of all of that is that there was no extradition treaty with Mexico. And so a lot of these people were leaving the US rather than, choosing to go to Mexico. They were trying to get away from some indiscretion. And Williams, of course, was right up there. His was a little more flamboyant than most, but still, we'll talk about that in a second. Excuse me. But they all had the same problem, and that was nobody had cash. And that issue of cash is woven through the very fiber of the colony. And in fact, there are letters from Austin lamenting the fact that he was a really not a good businessman. He never had money. His father had made and lost millions, and he desperately excuse me, needed money to build up this colony. So what I want to do before we get into Williams is talk a little bit, as I've mentioned, about the headquarters of the Austin colony, because most of you would not be aware that this map was drawn by Samuel May Williams. And in fact, he was the one who coined the term the Old 300. Many of the colonists made the decision to have a town lot, and while they were trying to develop their land, they would have shelter from Native American incursions. They would have access to supplies, and they would have a camaraderie with the other colonists who would share their issues and what they had learned. So if you look, let me see if I can do this. So this is where they all lived. And these little bitty lots are the crux of what Sarah is working on. And you see the Brazos River here. And off the Brazos, you see this little creek called Arroyo Dulce. And this area up here is the area that Austin and his chief lieutenants moved to. There were a lot of reasons for that. But Austin and Williams found that the period of 24 to 27-ish, it became just untenable to get work done because there was just this, nagging constancy of everybody wanting something and demanding time. Just to show you a little bit about this whole area up here, you see that Austin chose the absolute farthest point he could, and he even had one lot buffer between him and the rest of the group. All of these lots were quite lovely, had the creek, it was spring fed, so the water was abundant, all prairie land, and other people came, like Gail Borden, who had the newspaper, Luc Lesaussier, who was an alcalde. We have, of course, the Colonial Land Office was here. Milton Knuckles, who was he was also an alcalde and a physician, and also, interestingly, the brother-in-law to Williams. And then on the other side, you had Dr. Peebles, who was a physician, but also sort of a a person interested in land and acquiring land. And he was actually the one who is attributed to saving all of the land records in advance of the Mexican army. He went on to Williams' property, got all of the documents in the abandoned land office, took them to Louisiana for safety, and then delivered them to Peach Point after the revolution back to Stephen F. Austin. So, and then the other person who I've enjoyed learning about is this man up here, Mr. Hope, a British man who had a nursery. And the interesting thing that I have learned about Stephen F. Austin and Williams is they were avid horticulturalists. They both had orchards on their property. Austin would send cuttings, and you know, they just had that common bond, which was, I think, quite lovely. So there was a moment after I started researching all of this that I thought, wait a minute, you know, if the land office was here, this was sort of ground zero. Everybody had to come to this one spot. And so there was an awful lot of value to understanding more about it. The reasons, which I'll get into really quickly, is that Austin just was kind of fed up with everybody. He wrote his sister Emily early on, you know, my house is a thoroughfare. I can't get anything done. And William Kennedy, who was a British diplomat, made the point that Austin was doomed to encounter a full share of carping opposition, which only the British can say, but that's exactly what it was. So, you know, we all know basically about Austin, but the question, of course, comes up, why would he choose this one man? And, you know, as we all know, this was not Stephen F. Austin's idea. He was 27 years old. His father had this great idea to colonize. He was ambivalent. He was willing to go and help his father, but this was not the life for him. He was happy in a very sophisticated cosmopolitan New Orleans, had no interest in leaving. And his father in the letters was basically just begging him to help. And of course, his dad died very abruptly. And so Stephen carried on to make this work out and be successful in his father's name. But when you think about it, this man is leaving this very sophisticated town, putting on buckskins, having to build a civil society in a country where he didn't speak the language at the time. And Mexico was in political turmoil. And he had heard that there was a man named E. Eccleston who was living in the colony and was a tutor and was fluent in Spanish and French and sophisticated. And he wrote and said, if this guy is as good as I hear he is, I want to hire him to be my secretary. And so with that, E. Eccleston, AKA Sam Williams, came to work as secretary of the colony. And before I get into too much about that part, I want to go over Williams' pedigree, because I think he was very different from the regular colonists. And that became clearer and clearer over time. He was from a prominent New England family that had gone back, you know, way before the Revolution. His grandfather had signed the Declaration of Independence. He had an uncle who was one of the first presidents of Yale. I mean, they were pretty hardwired into the new country. And he had an uncle, Nathaniel, who lived in Baltimore, who had a commission house and bought and sold goods internationally. And the teenager, Sam Williams, went to work for Uncle Nate. And that's where he made a lot of good contacts, and he understood about commerce. And those things stood him well and stood the country well. among the many people who bought things were the Lafitte brothers, and they bought their sailcloth for their ships that were registered under Argentine flags. And so it's a bit unusual but as a teenager, Williams was put on board one of the ships as supercargo. And as best I can tell, what that means is that sometimes cargoes would sort of lose a little bit en route and people would skim some off the top, and the sales didn't really work out. And so there was a good deal of fraud's a big word, but people were lining their pockets. So to have supercargo was a person from the commission house who went and negotiated the sales of whatever it was. And for some reason, he then decided to stay there for several years. For us, the good part was that he became completely bilingual in Spanish, and he understood a great deal about Latin cultures. And that was something that was quite unique in the colony, including Austin himself. So there was a point where this whole, I'm not really E. Eccleston, I'm Samuel May Williams came out. One has to wonder, whatever it was he was running from, it had to have been reasonably significant, or he wouldn't have even changed his name. But at some point he came out, told Austin, and Austin was like, fine, as long as you're a good person, everybody deserves a second chance. So with that, he became the secretary, and he did the sort of minutia of setting up the stability of the colony. Austin felt very strongly that everybody had indiscretions at some point, but they deserved a second chance, but they had to have references. And so he vetted the references, Williams. There was a certain amount of land you could acquire depending on the use and the size of your family. So that was all negotiated. He sent out surveyors. The surveyors made their maps and came back. And then once that was all agreed upon and the agreed price, the land title was issued. Now, the land title was issued in triplicate. The landowner had a copy in English. I believe the one in the land office was in English. And then there was one in Spanish for the Mexican government. So that's an enormous amount of work. And then subsequently, they had 5 years to build their property to an extent that was satisfactory to the impresario. So in the early days when they lived in town, Williams kept his head down. He worked on a whiskey barrel that had been upended, and there are receipts in the Rosenberg Library for the fact that he had 2 chairs made so that at least he could sit during this tedious work on a chair. So let's talk just a little bit about those early days, because as I said, it's unusual when somebody decides that they really, really need to hide who they are when they're leaving. So not only did Williams get on, I think it was the Good Intent was the ship that they took from New Orleans, but he had a woman who was represented as his wife, who apparently was not. And they immediately were recognized by Angelina Peyton, who you probably know more as Angelina Eberly from the Archives War. But she and her husband, her first husband, were coming, and she immediately recognized Williams and knew that Mrs. Eccleston was not Mrs. anybody, or if she was, she didn't know. Then Mrs. E had a child, and apparently was very difficult. She was difficult, didn't like the wilderness, didn't want to be there, and then just abruptly left. Brown Austin, who was Stephen F. Austin's brother, wrote that he was glad that the she-devil finally left so he could have peace. So she must have been pretty bad. Mrs. Peyton was quite the gossip. And of course, having the only well, there were several taverns in town, but having a popular tavern and nothing to do but drink and gossip, she was all in. And there was a man who was not a member of the Old 300 who came, a Dr. Lewis Dayton. He was disgruntled about whatever and decided that the thing to do would be to hire a minstrel to print up new words to a folk song that everybody knew. And he passed them out and then, went through the town singing and, of course, amusing everyone. Just to give you sort of a flavor, the chorus was, "The United States, as we understand, took sick and did vomit the dregs of the land. Her murderers, bankrupts, and rogues, you may see, all congregated in San Felipe." And everybody thought that was hilarious. They went along town whistling and giggling. And Stephen was out of town. His brother was not. And Williams was infuriated. And they decided that they were going to have basically a kangaroo court. Dragged Dayton out of the Peyton Tavern, tarred and feathered him, and that was it. He was gone and clearly did not want to come back. But when Austin came back, he just said, that's it. This is definitely a watershed. I want calm. I want peace. I want people to get along. I don't want gossiping. And I certainly don't want this sort of, frontier justice. All of this is just too much. We're moving. And so that was the genesis of why they moved to the absolute boundary of the Austin colony. I could talk for days on him, on Williams, but I do want to make just a couple of comments about things that he did. He was the very first postmaster in Texas, which was quite a plum assignment and gave him leverage and contacts. He and Austin together formed a separate colony. He financed the Texas Revolution with money together with his partner, Tom McKinney, and put $99,000, of which I think they only got, pennies on the dollar back. And he is the first person who ever formed a bank in Texas. Again, we have that sort of money lending, nobody has cash thing. And through all of this, I kept thinking, why is it that no one seems to notice this man? And I think Judge Bell, who was a contemporary, made the point that Williams really wasn't known well to the next generation because military glory is so much more enduring than civic honors. And I think indeed that is the story of Texas in many ways. The next question, sorry about that, is so why is it we should even look at Sam Williams? And this is also, we're saying the period before the revolution, so up to 1836. And, the obvious things are that he worked with every single one of the old 300. They had to have all come to his property, to the land office, to either give him cash, give him some sort of monetary equivalency. Cows and a cow and a calf was equal to about $8. And, there were all of these things that you could barter. And also he kept track of what everyone owed to everyone else. So if this person owed someone a promissory note and that instead of giving it to this person, it goes back to Williams because, 5 people along all owe each other money. It was very complicated, and he did an excellent job keeping up with it. Also keeping up with all of Stephen F. Austin's accounting because he was hopeless at business. But the several important things to me were that he knew the power of contacts, and he had established contacts through an extensive family network in the US, through all of his plum assignments and his time living in Latin America. He had great contacts there too. And of course, established them in the colony as well. We know from anecdotal reports that Austin ate all of his meals in the Williams home. And he and Sam became very close. And in fact, so we know also that at that point, Austin gave his cook, Mary, to Sarah Williams out of devotion. And I'm sure she must have been a good cook, and he knew he was going to eat there every day. But when Austin's brother, Brown, died, Austin was just disconsolate to the point that Williams felt he couldn't be left alone. And for a period of 6 months, he lived in the Williams house. Likewise, after prison, even though Williams had moved on to Quintana, Austin chose not to return to his cabin, but he chose to return to the Williams house. And we have lots of receipts about what he needed and how he needed it, whether it was a mattress or brandy or his desk or, all kinds of things. And he asked for very specific things and mentioned that he and De Zavala and Grayson were going to be there and try to hash out what this new republic was going to look like. And then, of course, that was all solidified in Washington on the Brazos. But the most intriguing thing to me about Williams was when he moved to Galveston, he kept all of his receipts. And those receipts were put in a trunk, and the trunk was put in the attic when he died. And when they sold the house and the trunk was discovered, it was donated to the Rosenberg Library. And in the early days, I became quite conversant with the archivist, Sean McConnell, and we all owe him a debt because he digitized thousands of documents. So it's much more accessible for all of us. So the next question, and Frank, I hope you don't mind, but the question is, why would you research the lot? And in one of the millions of emails, I thought Frank said it the best of why. He said, Austin and Williams lived or worked there for a dozen years, had a privy, cook oven, kitchen, storage, trash pile, a corral for horses, hitching post, a yard area for all kinds of people to stop by, get on and off their rigs to get their land grants. The Texian Army and the Mexican Army also stopped by for a visit. This was the busiest place in Texas. And I thought that was great. So thank you, Frank. So now what I want to do is try to talk about this intersection I mentioned in the beginning about Texas history and historical archaeology, because I'm sure this is all very obvious to y'all, but it was not to me how, the amount of historical research I did is only as good as your ability to prove it. And likewise, digging something up, particularly, I hope y'all will go over here and look because we've got, some of the artifacts, but, I'm particularly fond of the fact that, there was a moment where Williams bought a ton of ceramic transferware, and we're finding it. We're not finding anything older or, or younger, but we have found an amazing amount. So I want to talk a little bit about this paper trail because it is extensive, and clearly, I know you can't read this, but to give you a sampling, the top here is just a basic order for goods, nothing particularly fancy. The one below it is an invoice from Milton Battle to construct some more refinements in the Williams house. And if you think about that in terms of the time, it's quite remarkable that he's having fancy doors made and cupboards when people, don't even have windows. The larger one is one of the many times he went on a shopping spree in New Orleans and bought all kinds of really fancy stuff. So within this, we've been able to really piece together a lot about his lifestyle. This next set of receipts is interesting because we have every receipt for building his house. We know that in the beginning, when they just up sticks and moved out to the garden lots, he had one of the cabins in town just put on a couple of yoke of oxen and dragged out across the prairie to be the land office and to be the location where he lived while he was building his big house. And we know likewise from receipts and things that he managed for Austin, that Austin just wanted a very simple dog trot, open middle, 2 rooms, not enough to have company, just enough for a man who needed his privacy to work and think. We also know how many sheet boards or whatever he needed. We know that his house was the only house that not only had windows but had 6-on-6 window panes and have the receipts for the window glass. So his house was painted white. The saga of his paint was a saga that a lot of things went through, and that is that it shipwrecked and the contents of the ship were purchased by somebody, but they really shouldn't have purchased the paint. And so he had a guy go and repurchase the paint. So, it was one of these very long, drawn out things, but he had the only white house in town. And it must have been quite lovely on a hill, basically over the creek. Likewise, we pretty much know that he wasn't like the rest of the colonists. These are clearly, we haven't found these things, but we have found receipts for what was inside these types of containers. The upper one is rum and brandied fruit, olives in an olive jar, rum, lots of whiskey. He had salmon brought in barrels, and the little green bottle is for cornichon pickles, which is not something your regular colonists probably even knew how to spell, much less what it was. So we can discern from this that he had money. He had no interest in living the sort of squalid life of, somebody who was out trying to work his land. We know that he was well placed to understand what the colonists needed and where to find those things. And we also know that he just wasn't a guy to get his hands dirty. The next slide is interesting. This is Jeff, who's in the UK right now, but as you can see, he's found the bottom of a demijohn, and this, we believe, is the neck, I hope, of the same one. It was in very similar location. His modus operandi was to buy barrels and barrels and barrels of whiskey, and then demijohns, which are much larger, sort of black glass. And so he would then transfer for his household use. Lots of brandy, lots of other, different kinds of wine, clarets. And this at the bottom that has all the numbers is his invoice from a butcher. Now, and these are bones that we have found just outside of my present day barn. So, whether these were his cattle that he got as in-kind payments and then sent off to have them butchered, or we don't know that piece, but we do know that he was not going to be out there doing it himself. My real love has been finding the ceramics, and there is an amazing array that we've found of all types. Certainly the stoneware, the more utilitarian ware. I wish I could have pictures of this. Was just one haul from one location in one day. This is my finger holding up a sherd on an ovoid vessel that Larry brought to the site to show us basically, what these things were like. And of course, since there wasn't a pot or any kind of a kiln in Texas until, I don't know, I think it was somewhere around 1845, all of these things had to come in from somewhere else. The green is, those are bands from mocha ware, which was quite fashionable. We have some feather edge, various types of transfer ware, and we're currently finding quite a bit of this willow pattern. And yesterday I was thrilled, and I should have taken a picture for this, but we actually found one of the doves, which was flying, which is the quintessential willow fable. And then at the bottom, these are examples that happened to cross mend of some hand painted earthenware. This one I like because, again, thank goodness for Larry. He knew within a second that one of these tiny sherds came from this pattern and was nice enough to find it online and buy it to give to me, which was very touching. The receipt at the top is for an entire dinner service in this one pattern. And we know it was this pattern because it says pale blue, and we know that that company only imported 4 different patterns, and this was the only pale blue. And then if you look over here, I tried to add some that we found in the last day, and it's pretty remarkable. The interesting thing about it is that we know that his house was sort of the party house, when dignitaries came, he knew how to set a table, he knew how to be gracious, and he had, the staff and the ability to do this, obviously, with Austin there. This next one, I think I may be going on. I don't want to go on too long because I want to be able to hear from you guys. But the land office, we know, was sort of a hangout place for a lot of people. Three-legged Willie, came every day apparently, and the various surveyors would come in and out, and people would come in and out. Since he was the postmaster too, one would assume that they were posting mail. The interesting thing about Williams and his finances was that he charged a fee for every one of his documents. And so to get a title, I think it was $11. And that was something, everybody had $11, and they weren't going to get the title until they paid the $11 in cash or cattle. And so he had a steady stream of income. He was supposed to get $1,000 salary a year from Austin, who again was hopeless at money, never had it. So he paid him in premium lands. So I don't remember the exact number, but by 1834 or 5, we know that he owned something like 48,000 acres. He owned all of Sugar Land. He owned all of the ship channel and an awful lot in various other places, in Colorado County, Austin County. But back to the land office, we are beginning to see pipe bowls and pipe stems. Charlie Gordy was good enough to restore this hobbling chain. And for those of you who don't have horses, in the day where there was not a tree to tie your horse to, the easiest thing was to tie 2 or 3 of the horse's legs together. And even though they could still walk, they just couldn't get too far. So that was the only way that people could make sure that when they woke up the next day, their horse was going to be within walking distance. Excuse me. So the last little thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that the reason I actually got started doing my research is that I saw a document from, the Texas Almanac in the 1850s. And it was a discussion by Nicholas Labadie, who had been one of the physicians attached to the Texian army. And he made the point that, the whole army was disgruntled, and they were told that they were going to have to move onwards to the east, and they weren't told where they were supposed to go. And then at the end of the evening, it turned out that they were going to camp on Samuel May Williams' property. And the point that was particularly interesting to me was that he made the point that they used the pickets from the fence as campfire because the woods were too far. And for those of you who've been there, the woods are not far at all. But the issue is if you have a choice between at 10 o'clock at night going out with an axe and trying to figure out how to cut a tree down, it doesn't matter if it's 2 feet away if you've got some firewood that you can just use in an abandoned house. And that in fact is what they did. So as Frank said, we did do extensive metal detecting, lanes, meter wide lanes back and forth, and came up with just an amazing amount of stuff. The first find, and probably the most exciting find, again, these 2 items meticulously restored by Charlie Gordy. The first one was a bullet mold. And that bullet mold, although we can't tell exactly, appears that it was for the larger musket balls. The smaller ones, as I understand, were from the Texians. The larger ones were from the Brown Bess rifle, which the Mexicans had purchased from the British after the Revolution. So, for better or for worse, that's what they were using. And then this small thing by the title is actually some lead to give you a sense of, at the fire at night, they would melt the lead, pour it into the bullet molds, and then be ready with their stash of bullets for the time when they were going to be in battle. And the next one is another one that I just find very interesting. And that is, this again is a Charlie Gordy thing, who researched all of this. But this is the first known horseshoe that was machine made. They were made in Troy, New York. And of course, the Texians just kind of left their breakfast on the table and grabbed their rifle and pair of socks. And there wasn't a camp farrier who followed. So these were made beginning 1830. They were sent in barrels with 4 different sizes. And so, it was pretty exciting for us to find one of those. So what I wanted to do, just sort of to wrap all of this up, is to let you know sort of the timeline of the actual garden lot. Because Williams moved, he resigned from his duties in the colony. He started a partnership with Tom McKinney, and it became McKinney and Williams. They first were operating out of Brazoria, but then moved and set up a warehouse in Quintana. Of course, being at the base of the Brazos River and before Galveston and, all of the area to the east was set up, the idea was Quintana could actually be the next big port. And so they had a large warehouse there. And as I mentioned, when Austin, so the house was vacant by mid 1835. By I think October, and I could be wrong on that, is when Austin was released from prison, first went to Brazoria, then came to San Felipe. He moved into the Williams house, and within a couple of weeks was made general. His first missives were from the Williams house before they moved on. So then we also know by the spring, the Texian army camped there. And that was, of course, in advance of the town being burned. And actually, it's a very nice location strategically, far enough away from the main town, but still, a mile and a half maybe. So as the town lots were burned, people made this assumption that the entire town was burned, meaning the garden lots too. And in fact, there was a letter that Austin wrote saying the only home I ever knew was burned. And so most people make the assumption that that means his house, his cabin, but it was not. I think he was talking just in a general term, because people came to his house as late as 1842, 1845, and physically saw the cabin there. And old timers remember the cabin being there, after the turn of the century. I just happened on the fact that Mrs. Williams had two little girls who died on the property and were buried there. And I'm not quite sure, it was just serendipitous that I noticed that there was a lease to a man named Hiram Bollinger. And that lease started in 1838. And in that, the agreement was that he could live in the house, which he was already living in the Williams house, if he would keep a sturdy fence around the graves and if he would pay the taxes. And it was a 20-year lease. And he was there, and then his sister lived there. He died in 52. His sister left right before the Civil War. So we know that the house was physically there for actually decades afterwards. So, where are we and where are we going at this point? I think the only couple of things we know for sure are that the Texian army was there. We've found a lot of proof to that. We are pretty sure that we have found either the kitchen or the burn pile. The unfortunate part is that most of it is under my barn, but we're finding incredible amounts of brick and bone and glass shards and ceramic shards. And so I think once we can find that definitively, we're going to be able to triangulate, by the topography, by the weather patterns. The wind is very definite where it comes at least 10 months out of the year. So we'll be able to tell where the house is from there. And of course, there are all kinds of other possibilities that we need to explore. So I want to really close there as I'm coming up to an hour, and just thank the people who have been doing this wonderful work out there. I mean, I think this picture of Frank who could pretty much reconstruct some of the barbed wire fences from all of the staples and the barbed wire. And of course, Bethy and Sandy have just been incredible field directors. I'm sorry that Leonie's not here, but she's been a stalwart too. And I just want to thank the stewards and also the board, current and past, for everything. And Chet Walker, and particularly Doug Boyd. And last, I have to thank Sean McConnell, even though he's not here, but because of him, he has made this so much more accessible. So with that, I'd like to just see if anybody has any comments or any questions. So. Yes, ma'am. Well, of course, UT, they have an incredible amount. It's just very hard to get there, and you have to do a lot of homework in advance. I mean, these days, I've spent so much time on the portal to Texas history, because it's wonderful to be able to read the newspapers and see, you can really piece so much together. I mean, even through the ads and what ships coming in and this and that. And there are a lot of places I should go to and I haven't been able to yet, but those are really the main ones. So, yes.
How large was the Williams house that was on the garden lot? The reason I'm asking is because we are finding such an array of ceramics.
Right.
That it's just incredible that he would have all of these different patterns of ceramics in what I originally thought was just a cabin.
No, it was a pretty good.
Had a house.
He had a big house.
A big house on the garden lot.
On the garden lot. I know that he built a second story to it after he started having more children. I mean, the original receipt for it was 10,000 cedar shingles. Math is not my long suit, so I'd just be, lying.
He also had a large house. He had a cabin in town originally.
Yes.
And he moved on to the garden.
And that became the land office.
That became the land office. Where did he live?
He lived in the land office while he was building.
Well, he was building
the
his house on the garden lot.
Yes.
Okay.
So the assumption is the land office was off to one side because Angelina Payton made the point that all of it was in the yard and it was on the cliff, which, I had visualized, but of course I was totally wrong. But, our assumption is the land office is to the west, only because that was closer to Austin's cabin, and Gail Borden took it over for 5 months or so, and he worked out of the land office, as did Peyton. Not Peyton. What was his name? Not Peyton. Anyway, Peebles. He'd come across the creek and work there in the Austin and Williams colony stuff.
I have a better idea now.
Yeah. So, and of course, all their kitchens were always separate. We know that there was a brick floor. There had to have been, we're finding a lot of sandstone. It could be sandstone chimney. I don't know. He doesn't strike me as a mud and daub kind of a guy. I think he did everything pretty well. And pardon me? I should just write it all out, look at the wood. And again, I'm not good at that kind of stuff, but my guess is that the downstairs was My guess is probably the house was like this size and then it was built up. I know it had high ceilings. And I know how many windows were in each room. I think there were 4 rooms on the ground floor, and then I'm not clear how they worked the upstairs. It was sort of a story and a half type deal, so it could have just been an open kind of bunk area. So, but they would have had at least 1 bedroom, 1 dining room, and 1 living room downstairs. And from the receipts of the type of furniture he bought, it'd have to be pretty big rooms.
Was the kitchen separate?
Totally separate. So usually what they would do is have the kitchen that was close, maybe 20 feet from the house in case it caught fire. So our assumption is that because the wind always comes from Galveston, so it comes from the southeast to the northwest, the kitchen would have been over here, so you wouldn't get all the smells in the house. Again, I could be totally wrong, but that's how I do it. Yes, sir.
That's why we're finding the window glass in the barn floor.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
How much land did you have?
Well, that piece was only between 12 and 15 acres. But he had, upwards of 100,000 acres by the time he died. He was, and strangely, he was almost a pauper by the time he died, one of those sort of land poor kind of guys. And also, I thought very strangely, he died without a will. There's this, it's very poignant. They put him in the living room of their house and put him on ice until the kids could come home for the funeral. So, it really gives you a visual. And, I guess that was done often. I don't know. So, yes, ma'am.
We have a question from the YouTube. One of the person who's watching it wants to know why the Imperial Sugar Company was sold.
Okay, so
Say it again.
The question is about why the Imperial Sugar Company was sold.
I can't tell you that, but I can tell you that he brought 2 of his brothers down in the 1830s, and they started a sugar plantation down there. And then it was sold, and I haven't kept up in current time. So sorry.
That's been a sweet deal.
Yeah, probably so.
William and her brother owned most of what is now Sugarland. That was when Stephen
Yeah.
Austin didn't have cash to pay him, so they were paying the land. And I believe they opened that first mill on Oyster Creek, which
Mhm.
became Imperial Sugar. So, yeah.
Mm.
That's what I mean. This guy has a name that's like, who is that? Man, he had a big footprint on, the founding of Texas.
Yeah.
He really did, when you read up on it.
And building the ships and paying for them for the Texas Navy. And I have receipts for, I sent Tom Knuckles a note and said, how long would this amount of munitions go? And he said it'd go the entire revolution. So it really bankrupted them. His ancestors. Well,
The daughter who left the sea chest where all the artifacts are down at the Rosenberg Library, which if you read up on that sea chest, it had its own story because it came from New Orleans on a ship that sank and the sea chest stayed afloat. And then it ended up in William's hands, but his daughter, her last name was Lee, as in Lee City.
yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
she ended up doing okay. I don't know about.
Yeah.
The rest of the son's daughter, but it was in the 1920s when she must have been about 80-ish by then.
Right.
She and her son took this to the Rosenberg Library.
Right.
They had over 4,000 artifacts. The man did not throw anything away, which
Yeah.
is fabulous for us.
And it was funny with that chest, because at first I thought, well, maybe that was the chest that Sarah took when they in the runaway scrape. It'd be kind of neat if she packed all the stuff and then took it. but it wasn't. He really struggled after the revolution because he was the commissioner that negotiated the peace. He was trying to get money to finance the republic, which was, of course, bankrupt. He was doing all this stuff. And his wife kept saying, come home, it's enough. And he kept, just got one more thing to do. And, then it would be, I'm going to have a baby. I have no one. My mother can't come. You have to come home. And the notes, they just got painful to read. But at some point, he, in sort of typical male brain, if you'll excuse me, thought, I'm going to buy goodies for all the kids and something really special for my wife. I'm going to send it all home and everything's going to be fine. So he did. But as I don't know what the percentage of ships didn't make it. It sank. And so he sent a letter, oh, do you love all the stuff? And she just wrote him a letter back and said, it sank. And I think she said, I'll go down and see if it can be salvaged. So she went down and dried it out. So that was the trunk. So
You say he resigned from secretaryship in 35. Remind us again when he started.
He started in 24. So early on. And I'm not, it was early 35 when he was, well, it might have been earlier than that because then he took on a job as the secretary of the Ayuntamiento. And during that period when Austin was in prison, it was a year and a half, there really wasn't anything going on. So the dates kind of, I'm not sure. So
24 to 35.
mm-hmm. So, yeah. And, there's a lot of discussion about a land deal in Monclova that he and Jose Carvajal and Dr. Peebles and a couple of others got involved with. And a lot of people thought that they had an advanced purchase of this land at a rock bottom price. It was a lot of land. And I think there were some promises, as I understand it, and I've tried to stay away from it because it was complicated. But there was always this discussion that he made it so that Austin was put in prison, but the timing doesn't work out. Austin was already in prison, and so there was this. There's this whole group of people that thought, well, he was just out for himself. And, so he should have just been expunged from our history. And the reality is none of the other guys got painted with that brush. And while it was not his smartest move, you can understand why he did it. So anyway.
I told you guys it was gonna be interesting. And we've only tracked the surface on this place, really.
Yes, ma'am.
I remember, there was some theory that a house still standing near your property may have been a building that was moved over there.
Well, we don't know. And we may never really know. I don't think if it was, it wasn't the entire house. So, people out there kind of scrounge, which is why we can't find any whole bricks because, people just think, let's just take this stuff. So, but we just don't know. And I think what our hope is that we can locate at least locations where these buildings would have been and then go from there. I mean, it's not like in the town lots where people left everything there and it burned so that, you've got all of this detritus. I mean, they picked up and they, the good stuff they took with them. So, but there are a lot of questions. I mean, I still want to know if the location where I think the children are buried is there, but that's a can of worms. And likewise, he couldn't have done, the peach orchard and all the warehouse of all of this tonnage of stuff without having one, slaves, and two, some pretty sophisticated storage. And who knows where that stuff would be. So we got a lot of work, but it's exciting. And these guys have done an incredible job.
What we're doing right now, her current house and the barn, and her storage areas and the like, are up a little bit of a ridge in the middle of the property. And we started finally finding stuff several months ago, back in the spring, around the barn, which is the western portion of the ridge. And we kind of started looking at the inner planks, the floor planks in a barn. It's like, what if we could pop a couple of these up without destroying? We believe the barn was built between 1870 and 1890. It's an old German design, we were told. We were able to pull a couple of planks up and did a couple of shovel tests in there, which produced a lot of ceramics, nails, glass. And so then we made the STPs into a unit. And the latest unit that we, 1 meter square, we've gone down 24 centimeters, yay big. And we found over 70 ceramic shards just in that 24 centimeters in that 1 meter. So, and bone, found a big old, looks like a cow bone, could be a buffalo bone, but probably a cow bone. And about yay big yesterday, charcoal and all that. So we think underneath the barn, we're hoping that there's some remnant of a brick floor under there. We started finding like thumbnail and pinky size pieces of brick, which we had not been finding previously. So again, hopefully we're getting close and all that. But unfortunately, we're not going to find a cornerstone that says "Ye Old Land Office" or anything like that, right? It's going to be a lot of guesswork. It's a puzzle. We're having a great time trying to solve the puzzle, so we'll keep at it. And we'll have Kathleen out here again. Talk to y'all. Hey, before we go, Kathleen has written a book. We cannot peddle books here, okay? Because it's a county property. I'll let her tell you where it's available and all that. But it's a really good book, second edition, and all that. And one more thing before we go, it's Texas Archeological month coming up, and the THC has had us and enlisted us to make, these are called pinch pots. It's a 8-ounce piece of clay. I made a 50 of them over there watching the Astros game the other day. It's got a couple of sticks in there and stuff. And there's been traditions in Texas of making things pottery wise and the like. And this is for kids, obviously. If you have grandchildren or children, do you like to take these to class, scouts, anything like that? I've got a box of 50 of them over here. Take as many as you want. Those that are left